Netflix, you can now watch a 10-part, well, the start of a 10-part documentary on Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls called The Last Dance, and it is the story of their dynastic run through the NBA. Now, on the NBA's website, it says on Michael Jordan's own biography, he is acclaimed as the greatest basketball player of all time. Is he the greatest? Really? Let's go down that rabbit hole. Bubba O'Neill, is Michael Jordan easily, unquestionably the greatest basketball player of all time as claimed?
You know, it's interesting, Scott and all you guys, good morning. You know, it's anytime we get into these greatest ever conversations, I'm always a little bit leery because, you know, you're dealing with different types of athletes, you're different types of equipment, just a totally different situation. In many cases, different types of coverages from people like us. But you know what? I do feel lucky enough to say that I've seen some of what I would believe to be the greatest ever. And I know from what I've seen, and I go as far back as Michael Jordan, as, you know, to our present time and LeBron James. And I think with the game, the way it was played at that time, and the greatness that he achieved, I'm leaning towards Michael Jordan. I'm fair with that comment.
Rick?
You know what? Michael Jordan is the greatest player that I've ever seen play basketball. Now, I didn't watch, you know, the likes of Julius Erving or Wilt Chamberlain or Bill Russell. You know, those guys were before my time. But in my lifetime, I would have to say Jordan is number one. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here because the game in any sport has changed. You know, the three-point shot in Jordan's heyday wasn't what it is today. But when you look at, you know, some of the underlying statistics that made him one of the greatest is whenever he was on the court, he was must-watch, must-see TV. You know, 6 NBA Finals, 6 titles, 6 NBA Finals MVPs, you know, a bunch of scoring records. He is, at least in my lifetime, the greatest NBA player ever.
Well, I think to expand on both guys' points, on Zamp's points and Bub's points, there's a difference often between best and greatest. And the example I'll give there is in a limited sense, in a nation unto itself, which is Quebec. Jean Beliveau is the best player who ever played for the Montreal Canadiens. The greatest player that ever played for the Montreal Canadiens is Rocket Richard, and there was a difference there. You have to watch that movie, The Rocket, to find out what that difference is. Part of it is cultural. Part of it is the updraft, as both you guys referred to, around them. Part of it is the way they get publicized, and the greatest part has to be the skills part. I think Jordan's the greatest because he's got both of those things.
First of all, Rocket Richard is not the greatest Canadian. Andre Racicot was the greatest.
Well,
Canadian.
There was that. Yeah, red light Racicot. And I think Jordan
is not. Jordan is not by any measure the greatest player. And I'll tell you why. Because Wilt Chamberlain, the only way you can measure players and their greatness is by the comparison to their contemporaries. And Wilt Chamberlain was miles ahead of his contemporaries, way further ahead of his contemporaries than Jordan ever was. Won championships, won MVP awards. And I mean, you can make an argument, and I would, that if you were doing a draft and you had all the NBA general managers and it was a career draft, there would be a lot of guys who would take Magic Johnson before Michael Jordan because of what he does with your entire team as well.
Well, that's what I say, the updraft, but I think he created that. Now, he had Pippen, who's probably the best guy to ever ride shotgun in basketball. Are we all agreed here? Best number two?
I don't know if I'd say that. I mean,
no.
I think
no, maybe not. The guy, Cousy and Russell. Yeah. Kareem and yeah.
How about Kobe and Shaq? I mean, I would put that right with that class as well.
Stockton, Malone.
Yeah.
I still think. I don't think the greatest part. I don't think applies to Wilt. You could argue best by the arguments that Radley's giving here. But I think when you combine the two together, when you combine offense and defense, and I mean, yes, obviously Wilt was a defensive player because you had to go around him. You couldn't go certainly over him. But I still think that Jordan would get that. But I don't think he's undisputably the best the way that I would say a couple of other people are in other sports.
Well, we'll get to that in a sec. But how do you compare players if not against their contemporaries? Because again, to say like, you know, Doug Harvey is the greatest defenseman ever, Who knows? Because the hockey, I've been watching some hockey on TV. Maybe you guys have too, replays of games. And I'm only talking on TV in this lockout. I'm only talking going back to the 80s. And I was watching with my son, who's 21, 22. And he goes, Dad, the hockey stinks. And even in the 80s, it was so far behind what it is now. There's no way to compare whether Doug Harvey or Larry Robinson or Serge Savard or Paul Coffey even, where they would be today.
But doesn't that go to our argument about our discussion, or at least the points that we're raising, that, you know, it's very difficult for your son to really relate with goaltenders and goaltenders' equipment and what was, you know, the players, and the fact that a lot of guys, even in the early 80s, were still using sticks without curves, for crying out loud.
Oh, yeah, we were watching a little bit of the Good Friday Massacre, the game between the Nordiques and the Canadiens in the Adams Division Final from years ago. And Dan Bouchard, the goalie for the Nordiques, like today, honestly, he looks like he was the equipment manager for a team who was thrown on there for practice. And he was a great NHL goalie, but compared to now, he looks horrible. They all do.
That's the fun part about debating sports eras, is you can plunk Alex Ovechkin in this era back in the 50s. Would he be the same player, and vice versa? Doug Harvey in today's NHL would be drastically different, I think. And some of the things we don't think about is some of the societal differences. You know, in a certain era, you know, people acted one way. You know, there wasn't social media in the 80s. How would, you know, a player like Wayne Gretzky react to social media back in the day, or the internet? Yeah, they had newspapers, radio stations, and TV stations, but the mentality even of the journalists today are much more, you know, attacking in terms of whether a player says something, you know, offside or not. So, yeah, I mean, that's one of the off-field or off-ice or off-court discussions that always fascinates me too.
Well, that's why I think when you're talking, there is a difference between best and greatest. And I think part of that's a very good point you're making there, Zamp. And a lot of that is part of what goes into the updraft that I talked about here, which creates the greatest. What else do you do for the sport? Do you elevate the sport? Do you make it something? Part of it is the era that you're in, as you're saying, that allows you, like, besides a negative part of social media, there's a positive part. Jordan caught the tail end of his career when he was really his reputation was really, really big, caught the start of social media in the late 90s. Other athletes didn't. Wilt didn't. But Wilt also didn't elevate the NBA to the point worldwide or even nationwide. I mean, he got his 100 points in Hershey, PA, with nobody there. That wasn't his fault. But that's part of the updraft that I'm talking about, to become the greatest. You elevate not only everybody around you, but the whole sport. You transcend it.
Well, I think in that case, then Michael Jordan easily becomes the greatest, and not just basketball, and perhaps any sport. I think maybe the only person that comes close to that would be Muhammad Ali, who I think is the only athlete, in my opinion, that you could go to any country in the world, even now gone for, I guess, a couple of years, and you could say the word Muhammad Ali, and people would basically know who you're talking about. Absolutely. Michael Jordan, perhaps Tiger Woods. I can't put Gretzky in that category because hockey is just not universally played all over the world. But you're looking at maybe 3 or 4 athletes in the world, and I maybe LeBron James is getting there because of the globalization of basketball and the NBA. But there are few people on a list that you could actually, as I said, go to Iceland, go to Afghanistan, Iran, Japan, Canada, and people would know the name.
Well, that's part of it. Is again what Rick was saying. If we expand Rick's point to say what the times are in, I would argue, given the limited world that existed in post World War I. Partly because of the pandemic, partly because we didn't have.
Started his career in journalism.
When I started there, when I watched, and the player that did that was Babe Ruth.
Sure, but using your example, Steve, using your point, and I think it's a fair point, but using your point about who has made the greatest impact, there are all kinds of athletes that Bubba just outlined, but if you go back to the NBA, I don't think then you can argue that Larry Bird and Magic Johnson would be the greatest, because they saved an entire league. That league was dead until they arrived.
They did, and they set the way, they paved the way, but really sort of what paved the way for them was Dr. J.
Yeah.
He changed the game so that, traveling wasn't called anymore. The dunk became the big thing, the individual athlete rather than the 5-post game. Started with Dr. J.
So if we have acknowledged, or we can't agree on Michael Jordan, and I think it's probably he may be, but I don't think it's undisputed. I don't think when the NBA says that he's acclaimed as the greatest, that's a wild overstatement, I think. But anyway, is there any athlete in any sport at any time who would be acclaimed as the greatest player ever in his sport, that there's really no question at all that he is the greatest player? Is there anybody who rises to that level, that there's just no debate?
Take it away, Bubba.
Well, and that's a tough one, Scott, because again, we're looking at different eras and again, the changing of the sport. But I'm going to go back to Muhammad Ali, and I think that is because of religion and the fact of what he did, and the fact that he lost maybe 3.5 years of this prime part of his career because he was fighting against not going to Vietnam for whatever reasons, whether there be religion or he just didn't want to go. Can't call it anti-American at the time. And by the time attitudes changed about the Vietnam War, he came back but missed several parts of his career. I mean, you look at really, if you know much about his career, and I know all four of you, all three of us do, all four of us do, but many people that are still learning about him, that guy had 3 careers in one, and 3 different eras, and fought through racism, and fought through the war, and then battled through age, really at a time when he was, beating people like George Foreman. So I think when you look at greatness, I think it's not only what you accomplish, as we've discussed, it's not just what you accomplish in the ring or on the floor or on the ice. I think it's so much of what goes around it. And I think that carries it. Hey, that guy, did he not? I mean, Steve, you would probably know a little bit better than me here. Didn't Muhammad Ali have a lot to do with, smoothing the waters in the Iran-Iraq war with the United States?
Yeah, there was some talk of that. Other people, depending on who you are, would say it was quite the opposite, that he might have fomented some of the stuff there. But yeah, he became an ambassador of some kind, and I'm going to agree with you in that I don't know that a player other than Babe Ruth, who did the same thing in a more limited way, because again of what Rick had mentioned earlier about the sort of culture that you were living in and what was available to everybody. But Muhammad Ali, here's 3 things that happened. I'll be writing about this for The Spectator sometime in the next couple of months. Here's 3 things that happened all within 5 months. John Kennedy was shot. The Beatles came to North America, and Muhammad Ali beat Sonny Liston to introduce what is the current, it still exists, the star system, the new star system and the talking star system in sport. Now, there's a lot of bad parts to that. But that was a man of his times. He was a man that was right in the middle of all that, and one of 3 major events.
He was, but was Muhammad Ali the best boxer of all time? I mean, no, look, there's no question about what his impact was out of the ring. Was he the best boxer of all time?
Sugar Ray Robinson was the best boxer.
I think there is a fair argument to be made that at their primes, and people blanch at this, but at their absolute primes, Mike Tyson may have beaten Muhammad Ali at his prime. I mean, look, they were both guys that were terrifying in the ring in different ways. I don't think you can absolutely say Muhammad Ali is the greatest boxer of all time. Sugar Ray Robinson probably is. But
I'd have to take you to task on that one about Ali and Tyson. I mean, I think as we discovered very quickly, as he, went on with his career, one, he was self-destructive in issues outside of the ring.
No question.
And inside the ring, I think as time would tell, he became very limited. A guy with a nice jab, a guy that big, tall stature, a guy that could bounce around the ring and frustrate people. I would put George Foreman, and I would love to see George Foreman in his prime against a Mike Tyson.
A lot of these guys.
I think Ali was too smart of a boxer to lose to a guy like Tyson.
Tyson, I watched. They just had the 30 for 30 documentary on Buster Douglas, and Mike Tyson by then was a guy who had become so distracted and was just not even. He was a shell of himself. But Rick, at his absolute prime, you know what? George Foreman may have been a better boxer at his absolute prime than Ali. Tyson might have been. There are a bunch. Doesn't take away what Ali's impact is or what.
No, not at all.
But look, this goes to the question though, Rick. Is there an athlete who was unquestionably the best at their sport where there is no debate?
Yes. Another one.
3 come to mind. Yeah, and Steve mentioned Babe Ruth. I mean, here's a guy who has a wins above replacement that is astronomically higher than the next closest in Cy Young. I think it's like 30 points higher.
Wow.
a guy who saved baseball, basically. The 1919 Black Sox scandal nearly ruined baseball. And here comes Babe Ruth from the dead ball era to now the live ball era. And he obliterates 59 home runs in 1920, and the rest is history. But two others come to mind. Tiger Woods, and I know there's going to be a lot of Jack Nicklaus lovers out there, and rightfully so, and Serena Williams. Two more individualistic sports. They're not relying on teammates, not necessarily coaches or trainers, but those are obviously in the fore. But Serena Williams, one of the most dominant athletes, period, in our generation, and Tiger Woods is right up there too. Two individuals who took hold of their sport, transcended their sport, made their sport more popular than ever before. Two athletes, I think, are probably in that category of unquestionably the greatest.
I would say Jesse Owens is right there.
Jesse Owens?
The problem there was that it was interrupted by war. And that's one of the problems when you're talking about Orr and Gretzky. You can't give it to Orr because he only played 7-8 years. And Gretzky did the same thing, roughly, over twice the period. And that's one of the problems, of course, with Jesse Owens. We never got to see him in that second and potentially third Olympics because of the war.
You mentioned Jesse Owens, too. How about a guy like Michael Phelps or Usain Bolt? Two guys, again, dominated their sport, absolutely dominated their sport. No one could beat them, and have left a lasting legacy.
Yeah, and the trouble with Phelps is that you got Spitz in there who did roughly the same thing.
Steve, you bring up hockey players, and I think one of the guys that, after a little research that all of us, I think maybe the most underrated guy that really could be in that greatest ever category would be Mike Bossy. And I know he only played a decade, but when you score 50 goals, 9 out of your 10 seasons, could you imagine, had he not had the chronic back issues, how many goals he would have scored?
Yes.
What about Shorty Green? We will go into Shorty Green. Hey guys, I really appreciate you doing this today. Stick around. This is the first time in 5 weeks I've actually put on a collared shirt. I've been wearing a t-shirt and fat pants at home. So hey, everyone got dressed up except for Rick. So we'll work on that for next time. Thank you for joining us here on Home Games. We'll be back. For Steve Milton, for Bubba O'Neill, for Rick Zamford. Take care.